I think what Mr. Vashee has covered is the national contribution, and indeed governments, African governments have made a commitment to put at least 10% of their national budgets towards agriculture. That's part of the African CAADP declaration. But there's also the Paris Declaration by donors, by the international community, where they've made a commitment to provide development finance. But those commitments have not been met. So it's a two-way process. Our African governments are not meeting their commitment at the moment. Less than 20% have met the 10% minimum that they committed to 5 years ago. And it was meant to be the minimum to grow beyond the 10% of the overall budget. But I think the biggest letdown has been on the donor side. So it is a joint agreement. There's got to be money to finance the development, but for as long as people are not putting up that money up front, we'll always be pointing fingers as to who hasn't paid their bills. But the money that's available is currently not enough to meet the basic commitments.
I think in the World Bank there has been a very, very substantial shift. The World Development Report of 2008 is a clear policy sort of guideline to a lot of national governments. And most importantly, it was developed with a lot of input from stakeholders. A very integrated approach where, from the farmer side, we were able to bring the viewpoints from Latin America, Africa, Asia, right up to Washington, into World Bank through a concerted formulation process. What is important there is that World Bank has done a rethink on subsidies where they're calling it a targeted or smart subsidy. And then there's also this phrase which I found very interesting, was the invisible hand of the public sector. All right? English is not my mother tongue, but I mean it was quite interesting to read some of these things. And there's also one critical issue which I thought was the recognition of civil society or farmer groups and the ability of farmers' organization to influence policy and facilitate change. There's a separate chapter on it altogether. So I think there is a shift. What has happened is, I think the food crisis has brought everything to a head, and I think people are now seeing. Lindiwe alluded to the new agriculture model, which even the Farmers First initiative is looking at a new agricultural model. There simply won't be the ability with energy costs to ship around food globally or within continents themselves. So the onus is now coming back to more localized production, closer to consumption centers, making sure that you have some sort of food security by producing yourselves. So I can say about that. The IMF, I'm not too sure whether there has been a shift. They're basically bankers, I think, to the banks or to national governments. But I don't see any reason why they would not also be looking at a rethink of how we can manage food security globally. There's also this issue. This brings something to connect this to global trading systems. I think we probably need to do, even within the WTO, whether we can look at the nearer issues of food security and climate change, which were never on the Doha development agenda. I think these are nearer issues which perhaps, before we conclude Doha, we need to look at that, whether indeed we need policy space or indeed space to make sure that we enable ourselves to have this kind of food security and measures to combat climate change, desertification, and others. I don't know if my colleagues want to come in.
Just to emphasize that the World Bank, yes, has changed, and there's a special facility that has been set up following the Madrid summit, where governments can make a request through this facility for inputs, and the disbursement of the funds are expedited. They don't have to go through the long bureaucracy and lending requirements. It's really a facility to make sure that for governments that have come out clear in terms of providing support to smallholder farmers so that they have access to fertilizer and seed, there's a special fund that's been set up, and Jeff Sachs and others are pushing that, so that countries such as Malawi, have access to a facility that will make sure farmers can grow their food rather than depend on food aid. Now, coming back to the issue of subsidy, just one quick clarification. I think part of the challenge we face in Africa is that the farmer we are talking about is not homogeneous. You are looking at the bottom 1 million, where you are talking of farmers who just depend on what they produce from day to day. So if those farmers don't get inputs, they are welfare cases. But they have capacity to produce, but they don't have access to inputs. Then you have the next level, which can, with a bit of support, purchase the access, the inputs, provided they are close by, the price is affordable. And then you have the top layer of commercial farmers who are already into mainstream commercial activity. All they need is a conducive policy environment for them to buy and sell their produce. And really what we are looking at is, how do you save that bottom million from crashing into welfare cases? How do you keep them on the table? By providing just $100 for them to have a bag of fertilizer, 2 kilograms of seed, rather than $1,000 as food year for the whole year. Because with that $100, they're able to get their seed, they're able to harvest 1 ton of maize, which is all they need for their household. But if you don't do that, you now need $1,000 for the whole year as food aid. So I think that is the level of the dialogue. How do you make sure that these potential welfare cases are productive farmers and they are food secure?
I think in the last few years there's been a rethinking in general, not just by the World Bank. And one important issue that, one important change that has happened is that in the 1990s, what we saw in the context of Africa was that the main focus in terms of agricultural productivity increase was on organic inputs, on organic resources. And fertilizers were seldom the object of many donor agencies or even development agencies that were working with smallholder farmers in Africa. And now, in the last couple of years, 2 to 4 years, focus has increasingly shifted in inorganic fertilizers. And let me say that organic resources have a very important role in terms of increasing productivity among the smallholder farmers in Africa and in general, because of the organic matter increase that you can have in the soils as a result of using organic resources. So they do have a very important role, but when we are looking at a lot of the production environments in sub-Saharan Africa, many are such that the organic resources are just not there in sufficient quantities. When you go to those low rainfall areas, 500, 600, maybe 400 millimeters a year, the biomass production is so low that you cannot just have sufficient quantities and also the qualities that you need to have that productivity boost. So in fact, you do need to, in most production environments, you do need to bring in the nutrients from the outside, and often then maybe combined with the organic resources to ensure both the kind of the soil health aspects, but then also to ensure that the productivity aspects are there. So this is just another kind of an example of the rethinking that I believe that has happened in the last few years among the donor agencies, among the development agencies that are working in Africa.